So welcome everybody to this webinar, and please note that it's being recorded. So on the topic, so until very recently, we had a lot of data on digital trade policy, but not systematic information on the topic. But now we have no less than 4 comprehensive databases and mappings of digital trade politics. So the Council of Economic Policies are happy to bring the 4 together at this webinar, and it will be moderated by Ingo Borchert. Ingo is a pioneer of rigorous services trade research and policy analysis. At the World Bank, he co-created the Services Trade Policy Database that you can all find on the WTO website. And he is a senior lecturer at the University of Sussex and the deputy director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory. And you can find a lot of interesting work of his on trade and services and policy analysis. So, Ingo, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Hildegunn, for that very kind and flattering introduction. It's indeed a great pleasure to be able to moderate that event. A warm welcome to our 4 panelists, Johannes, Fritz, Janos, Ferencz, Erik van der Marel, and Susan Aaronson, whom I will introduce in greater detail in due course. And thanks to everyone indeed for joining this panel on digital trade policies. It's not your everyday webinar. The 4 panelists, between them, I think pretty much cover the global expertise on collecting regulatory information affecting digital trade and data. So it's quite unique. I mean, there are, of course, other related publications. For instance, both the OECD and UNCTAD publish each a digital economy report, and there's USTR's national trade estimates. But the 4 databases that we will discuss in this webinar cover a good deal, if not most, of what's publicly available in terms of digital trade policies. And it's just about time for this kind of transparency initiatives. I mean, no one really quite exactly knows how big digital trade is. It's hard to measure and hard to regulate, but a ballpark figure for the global 2019 value of digital trade might be somewhere between $5 and $6 trillion. So it's just huge. And that figure obtains if we tally up all trade that's digitally ordered and or digitally delivered. That's one of the standard definitions. So it's huge, and all this trade is being crucially underpinned by data flow. So it's right and just that we also include data governance in this webinar as well. So given these stakes, there couldn't be a better time for discussing and indeed raising, I hope, transparency about digital trade policies. So what we'll do is that each panelist will give a short overview of their respective database, and then we'll open up the panel for reactions and for general Q&A. I would hope that we can make this webinar interactive and also have your questions answered. So please do use the Q&A function throughout to post your questions, and I'll put them to the presenters either directly after their presentations or at the end. And without further ado, let's hear first about the Digital Policy Alert, and I'm delighted to introduce Johannes Fritz, who's the CEO of the St. Gallen Endowment for Prosperity Through Trade. That's a fantastic name, a Swiss non-profit organization. The St. Gallen Endowment is the institutional home of the Global Trade Alert, who many of you, I guess, will know, and its latest offspring, indeed, the Digital Policy Alert. Johannes's work is focused on bringing transparency to public policy choice. He's an economist, but he has additional training in computational text analysis and machine learning. Johannes, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ingo, for the nice introduction and the great opportunity really to join this panel with people that I also consider as pioneers in our topic today, bringing transparency to policy affecting the digital economy. As Ingo said, I speak today about the Digital Policy Alert, which was just published 6 weeks ago and now stands at around close to 700 entries that can be accessed freely on our website, which is digitalpolicyalert.org, and also through our main site, the Global Trade Alerts website. While new, the Digital Policy Alert is a multi-year initiative that started last summer and will take a leap, hopefully, in quarter 4 of this year and grow over the years to come. We built the digital policy alert based on a decade of experience that we have from the Global Trade Alert, which you may know, where we have enabled our policy analysts with tailored technologies to create a timely and accessible database of trade policy changes in goods, services, and investment. Our transparency, we built our transparency objectives for the digital policy alert are really to bring this knowledge that we gathered over the years at the Global Trade Alert to the digital domain and start mapping out what actions are taking and ongoing in regulating the digital economy. Our transparency objectives for this initiative are to create, again, a comprehensive and accessible record for the policy landscape. This includes coverage across 11 policy domains, from data governance to content regulation, competition policy, and classic economic policies that we know from the GPA, subsidies and trade policy changes. To capture this spectrum of activity in the digital domain, we believe it's vital to go beyond actions in the legislature to also exclude the executive and, in some cases, rulings in the judiciary, for instance, when there's a large reinterpretation of a norm or law. As the GTA, the digital policy alert is based on official sources. We are obviously informed from analysts, news, and what's going on in the media, but we always aspire to track down the statement by the government or the official gazette and document it there and leave that on the site for the. In general, this is a global public good. Like the Global Trade Alert, we want to create a searchable, free and portable record. It's all on the website. You can subscribe to it. You can take it with you in all formats that we can provide. And we update it timely as we document it on our site. Our new initiative, the Digital Policy Alert, has several purposes, but 2 clearly stand out, and these are reflected in the 2 data products that we are launching this year. The first data product is what you see on the right-hand side already. This is our current website, which is targeting users who are interested in the activity that's going on in regulating the digital economy as it occurs, get an overview, or notified when there are new developments through the notification service. It's available now on the GTA's website, or digitalpolicyalerts.org. It covers, again, like our full scope already. And it's crucial, though, what we do here is the words policy making process. We believe it's important to document the activity in the field, to not just go between the branches and across the branches, but also go start really from the very start of the policy-making process and document it all the way to its final legislation or removal. We believe so because in the digital economy, we are just at the cusp, really, of our knowledge about and there is high uncertainty about what needs to be regulated, how it needs to be regulated, and what the material trade-offs really are and side effects. And so for this uncertainty matters for us because it gives rise to unintended consequences like the fragmentation of the internet, even when policy is formed with the best intention and information available. With our first data product, the fast and early warning system, we want to characterize the regulatory process in its early stages to allow really interested parties to engage and speak up and help policymakers and regulators understand what the trade-offs are, who the proper regulated object is, and what those side effects could be. That means we track a bill through events, as we call them. So an event from the introduction of a bill, say in the US Congress, through its amendment, through its adoption, and its implementation. In this early warning system that's available on our website, we do this right now for the G20 and the European member states, so roughly 45 economies. We launched in the middle of April and now stand around, I'll say, close to 688 events that translate into a couple of hundred interventions or policy changes proper. We're eager to expand this geography in the future and go beyond those 45, and we'll always announce when we can expand our proper coverage to economies like emerging markets. I announced we have 2 things going on this year. The big leap, our big project ahead, is the second data product. which targets those who seek to understand whether the internet is fragmenting, where the fault lines are, and how far the digital plates tectonic may have drifted apart already. We aspire to contribute to this important debate in the fourth quarter, when we will make publicly available detailed mapping of the regulations and policies that may affect the digital economy. We'll continuously update this mapping based on the information we gather in the early warning system, and again, make it publicly available, take it with you, make it comparable, so users can get an insight into what's going on and form an opinion. Our mapping shall offer the rich and searchable interactive descriptions that users of the Global Trade Alert are used to. It's an ambitious project because, as we'll sure get into this in the coming hour, this is a highly complex and high dimensional space that we are talking about, and so we have plenty of challenges ahead. But we hope that in the fall we can enable users to understand their national policy choice in greater detail, and to contrast it to that of other jurisdictions or potential benchmarks. This is the first instance of the digital policy alert. You see a few mountains on the top right. Those go from the Matterhorn to the Kilimanjaro to the Everest. This is a multi-year project. We are embarking now. We are very excited to be in the Matterhorn. We are now approaching the Matterhorn, which will be climbed hopefully in the fourth quarter with the launch of our new product. We will then extend it through over the years to more countries and deepening the historical record, going back in time to allow also research with a higher time dimension to be done in this area where we, as you said, we consider ourselves to be only at the cusp of knowledge. With this, I would hand it over to Ingo again, a short introduction to get the discussion going. Thank you for the attention. If you are interested in the digital policy alert, please go to our website and subscribe to the notification service, or reach out, because we are always keen to learn on how we can make it better accessible, what there is out there that we should have our eyes on, and just engage with users of the data. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Johannes, for that great overview. Seems very apt that you have these three huge mountains up there as logos. It seems very ambitious indeed. Can I ask you perhaps on these 11 policy domains, on the spectrum of policies that you are covering? Now, I think one of the hallmarks of digital trade policies is that a measure that potentially affects digital trade is not necessarily a classic trade measure or trade policy measure. And so I'd be very interested to whether you could give us a few more details about, or examples at least, of what these policy domains are that the Digital Trade Alert is covering. That would be great.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. Yeah, the mountains are sharing the ambition. In hindsight, I think we should have taken A76, which is the world's largest iceberg, because the deeper we go, the deeper it gets. And so in terms of the policy, what's really new for us is different from the Global Trade Alert, where you say we cover the classic industrial policy, trade policy domain. In the digital policy domain alert, we go into areas of content and intellectual property, the data governance sides. We start documenting those as well. We also go into competition law, or its adjustment to big tech and other considerations. So this is a very different regulatory environment that we are used to in GTA, and this is something where, starting last summer, we reached out and tried to understand, and also had a really good look at the other people's work on this panel, just to understand how they approach the problem and what we can do to use our knowledge and provide a new blend for this.
Super. Well, thank you very much, Johannes. There aren't any audience questions at the moment. I know the icebergs and the glaciers will soon be gone, so I think you're well advised to stick with the Matterhorn for the time being. So in that case, I think we are moving right along to Janos. If you could stop sharing your screen, Johannes, please. We would move on to Janos. Janos Ferencz is a trade policy analyst at the Trade and Services Division at the OECD. He works on services trade and policy globally using the OECD's Services Trade Restrictiveness Index, the famous STRI, for which he manages the annual updates of the STRI regulatory database and the associated indices. He has developed the OECD's digital STRI tool, and he's contributed to analyses of trade and market openness, cross-border data flows, and trade implications of these new technologies, including artificial intelligence. So it seems he's just the man. Janos, over to you.
Thank you, Ingo. That's a very kind introduction. And then just to second a bit what we heard also before that, I'm really delighted to be on this very special panel today, because I think what we all bring together is quite important for how we look at digital policy. And my presentation, my contribution to this discussion will focus a bit on what is the OECD's work on building the evidence base for digital trade policy. And I would like to focus particularly on the OECD's Digital Services Trade Restrictiveness Index, or the STRI. And my presentation will try to answer three main questions. The first one is, what is the digital STRI? The second, how did we develop the STRI, and what does it tell us? So what is the digital STRI? Essentially, as you also mentioned, Ingo, this forms part of the broader STRI family, where the OECD's long-standing work on measuring the regulatory environment for services trade has been developed through this STRI tool that looks at barriers across 22 different services sectors and 48 different countries. The digital STRI is a subcomponent of this broader project, where we look at specifically barriers that affect digitally traded services. Essentially, there are two main components. The first one is a regulatory database that collects information from laws and regulations in a systematic and comparable way. And the second component is a quantitative index that translates this qualitative information that we collect in the regulatory database into comparable composite indices. In terms of country coverage, the current digital STRI has the same country coverage as the standard STRI, but we are working this year to expand that coverage significantly, thanks to collaborations with various different institutions and different economic commissions over the world. We hope that by the end of this year, we would be able to add as many as 30 new countries to the coverage of the digital STRI. How did we develop this tool? As I mentioned, a lot of the underlying methodological and structural methodology is the same as for the STRI. The list of measures that you see here, they are to a large extent derived from the existing sectoral STRIs, particularly those that are important for digital trade, such as telecommunications, computer services, financial services, and retail. We have also structured these measures into 5 different policy areas that you can see on the left side of the screen. The first one focuses on measures that affect infrastructure and connectivity. Here we look at various different measures on telecommunication services, such as interconnection. But importantly, we also look at measures that relate to cross-border data flows. The second policy area looks at electronic transactions, where we look at conditions that affect e-commerce licenses, electronic signatures, etc. The third one focuses on payments, whereas the fourth one looks a bit at the implications of the measures that protect and enforce intellectual property rights. The last one captures other barriers that we couldn't classify in the previous 4 areas, but these would include issues such as performance requirements or limitations on downloading and streaming. And the way to look at the digital STRI is really as a function of the other STRIs, where we look at the cross-cutting or horizontal barriers. So that means that when you look at barriers to digital trade, a lot of those barriers are actually sector-specific. And what we wanted to achieve in the digital STRI is to gain a horizontal economy-wide picture first. And then, of course, we also have the standard sectoral information in other STRI sectors, where we can look at sector-specific barriers on foreign investment, movement of people, public procurement, barriers to competition, etc. So to give you an example, for instance, we know that many of the barriers that affect specifically professional services, for instance, there could be related to that sector. So we look at the digital STRI to gain a horizontal picture of what is happening when it comes to regulations on digital trade. And we look at the sector-specific STRI for professional services to gain that fine detail, for instance, on other measures like licensing, etc. That would be sector-specific. In terms of data collection, the information in the regulatory database is collected by the OECD itself. We look at primary sources, regulatory databases. We don't use surveys or other means, but we look at all the information that we can publicly find on the internet. But we also undergo various data verification exercises, first by the country itself, and then also we have a peer review exercise whereby the countries have the opportunity to comment on each other's databases. Regarding the scoring, we apply a binary scoring, which is in line again with the STRI approach, where we assign zeros when we cannot find a specific barrier and the 1 if there is a specific barrier. This is also complemented with different hierarchies and logical connections between measures that are important to build into the scoring so that you reflect the different connections between these measures. For instance, in a specific case where there are stringent conditions on transferring data abroad, that might have implications for other type of services that really depend on data flows like payment services, downloading and streaming, etc. In terms of the weighting, we applied the standard STRI approach where we collected a weighting scheme that's based on expert inputs. This allows us to reflect better the relative importance of different measures across different policy areas. And the last point on data collection is about the annual update. So again, this is a very important component of the STRI where we want to keep this information up to date. And every year we undertake to have a look and review all the information and complement based on recent policy changes. In terms of the existing tools, all the information are available on our website, and you can find different tools such as the online policy simulator. This has been by far the most popular tool that we have. And as you can see here, it's very easy to use, and you can find information for a country of choice per each of the 5 policy areas. And it also gives you the fine details regarding the regulatory information. So if you click on the little arrows, you would be able to go directly to the relevant laws and find also a short comment. You can also change the answers yourselves to see what would be the potential implication of regulatory changes, and also compare to other countries of interest or potential trade partners. So this is a very intuitive and easy to use tool that provides basically the entire digital STRI in a single window. Now, what does the digital STRI tell us? And I just want to share 3 brief messages. Firstly, what it tells us is that digital trade, while it's global, the regulations that govern it are not. And as you can see here, the regulatory landscape looks very fragmented across countries. And the gap between the country with the lowest level of regulatory barriers, so the lowest indicator, and the country that has the most stringent environment or the highest indicator, the gap between these two is really immense. If you zoom in a little bit, then it becomes clear that the most important barriers still remain with regard to infrastructures and data connectivity. So this is something that transcends across all the different countries. And the third message is about the evolution over time. And the digital STRI is available all the way back to 2014. So if we take that time span from 2014, we see an increase in the level of digital trade barriers, with the exception of last year, which was partially a result of the COVID pandemic, where governments have slowed down on imposing new barriers, and rather they have implemented more facilitation measures, for instance, on electronic signatures and electronic payments. And just to conclude on what's next for the digital STRI, we will continue the annual monitoring exercise of policy developments. We also want to provide more timely and more policy relevant analysis based on these tools. We are working to increase the interinstitutional cooperation. We have ongoing collaboration with several UN economic commissions and the WTO. And we are also expanding, as I mentioned, the country coverage and also enhancing our regional analysis. The OECD has, of course, a lot of other relevant work in the digital trade area. The most recent ones are these three that look at digital trade rules and regulations, mapping commonalities on cross-border data flows, and an interesting paper on trade in the time of parcels. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about our work on this.
Thank you very much, Janos. This is obviously a very, very impressive effort, and I imagine you are having an army of people with you or under you, to pull all of this off. I think this is really noteworthy in a couple of respects. One is a peer review on the vetting. So you bind the governments in, and you can vouch sort of for the accuracy of the information. You aim for fairly high frequency updates, so the product will stay sort of relevant. And I think the OECD is obviously having a fantastic interface to reach out to various stakeholders. By far, not all of them would be researchers or academics using the quantitative part of the information, but all kinds of stakeholders from the civil society. So I think that having that interface, that the information is actually accessible, I think is very, very important. I think for want of time, we'd move right along to Erik, so that we don't eat too much into our discussion time. Our next speaker is Erik van der Marel. Erik is a senior economist at ECIPE. He's an associate professor at the Université Libre in Brussels, and he's a consultant economist at the World Bank. He's got deep expertise in digital trade, services trade, cross-border data flows, and associated digital services trade policy. Prior to his appointment at ECIPE, Erik's been teaching at the LSE in London, at the European University Institute, and the World Trade Institute. And he's provided various capacity building courses to national ministries. So he has a long experience in the realm of services trade and digital services trade policies. Erik, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can everybody see my slide? Yeah, should I?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can, but maybe you can switch to full screen.
Yeah, hang on. Yeah, so here it is. No? Yeah, so I'm going to tell you something about digital trade restrictiveness, how we initially measured, because as you can see, there are two other databases and indexes that have been updated in the meantime. And we at ECIPE started a year ago, or a couple of years ago, and so I will tell you something about this. Now, first of all, I mean, yeah, this is the main work that we did, and we called it the Digital Trade Restrictiveness Index, and that is done together with Martina Ferrecania and Husukli Makiyama, the two other persons that are attached to ECIPE, and together we made the Digital Trade Restrictiveness in a big report and also a website that I will tell you in a couple of slides. But first, I think the main motivation is just to give you a bit of a context. I think everybody is sort of well convinced about this. I mean, the main reason back then for why we thought this was very important was that there was a sort of a different type of globalization going on, and that's what you can see here on the red line. And that centered a lot about services trade, but not only, of course. But you can see that, I mean, there has been a sort of an accelerating pace of that digital part of globalization. And that pace is going stronger than other flows that we traditionally measure as part of globalization. Also, of course, there's a bit of goods, ICT, goods trade going on. But the main focus for our motivation was that services part, that you can also see summarized what's going on in terms of new flows is, of course, data. And I think Janos also already told something about the importance of these cross-border data flows. And as you can see in the right-hand panel, I mean, these flows have been rapidly rising. And at the same time, you saw governments imposing policies. And so we thought it was very important to record it, as anybody else, of course, here in this panel. Now, it has resulted in this output. So we have a special website at ECIPE called the Digital Trade Estimates. And the Digital Trade Estimates entry point website looks like this. And so that is what we have developed with all sites, all kinds of tools that you see on the right-hand side. And then you have a couple of entry points of the database, the DTE report, and then a couple of other publications. Because that's, you know, the DTE project, the Digital Trade Estimates project, covers a couple of outputs. That is the database itself, where you can find all these measures recorded that we have picked up, that we have covered. And then all these measures that you can find in the database, we have transformed them in an index, as much as, you know, the OECD has done. And then also we explain the whole methodology and the scoring and the weighting in a DTRI report together with results. And I think a third plank of what we have provided, which I think is important, is also we have taken it a step further to do some analytical work with the data that we have collected. And so those 4 elements are really what you can find in the database. And that's what we have produced in terms of, yeah, the DTE project, but of course it points down to the DTRI, the Digital Trade Restrictiveness Index. Now, the DTRI itself, I mean, to give you a further explanation, is really covering a lot of measures. So it covers more than 100 individual policy measures that we have sort of summarized around 4 clusters. So if you read the report, these are the 4 pillars of the DTRI, of the index itself. First is that we cover also a little bit of, you know, traditional trade measures such as tariffs that you can find on the fiscal restrictions next to a couple of other ones. Then you have the investment type of restrictions that we call altogether establishment restrictions. So, you know, restrictions on FDI in digital sectors, but also a little bit on IPR measures. Then I think what is the most important and sort of the real novelty of this index, also a big motivation for why we did it, was restrictions on data that is summarized and put together in a separate cluster. And then you have other sorts of restrictions, notably related to online transactions and e-commerce, that we have summarized on the trading restrictions. But again, you can see the asterisk, like under the restrictions on data, that is really the core part, I think, of this whole project. And also, like further on in my presentation, I mean, a lot of it is focused on these kind of restrictions. Now, this is what it looks like in terms of organization. So each of these clusters have their own chapters, for which we have recorded and categorized all these more than 100 restrictions that we have found. So again, cluster A covers 3 chapters, you know, covering tariffs and trade defense measures, but also taxation and subsidies. Cluster B has, as I say, investment-related restrictions, and then cluster C has 3 different chapters on data-related restrictions that cover restrictions on, you know, data itself, but also restrictions that are related to intermediate liability and also content access. And then you have the last cluster that covers 3 chapters on, for example, quantitative trade restrictions and other restrictions related to e-commerce. And these are all accessible on the website for free. And this is what it looks like if you would enter, if you are motivated to really dig into the database and find restrictions that are, for example, in New Zealand, or for example, in Pakistan, because we also cover a couple of developing countries. And you can then sort of select a chapter and even a sub-chapter, and then the measure comes on your screen, like, you know, what Janos, a bit similar on what Janos presented, I mean, in this database. Now, there are a couple of other headings that you see next to that database option is the DTRI report that you can access, and then a couple of publications as well. So if you would use all these numbers, and I think that's also nice to show a little bit what you can do with this, is then you can show in nice sort of figures the extent to which things are regulated at the moment. And I just take this as an example for data-related policies, because as I said, there's a lot of interest in that regard. And so this is how it looks like if you would plot all these restrictions next to each other and you would compute using weights and scoring the level of restrictiveness. And so you can see here that, I mean, some countries are more restricted and some other countries are less restricted. And so normally what you would sort of think is that similar kind of countries are more restricted and a similar looking kind of group of countries are less restricted. That is what we have found, at least to some extent, true. So Russia and China and Turkey are, in this case, but also for the wider index, more restricted regarding data. And as I said, also regarding all the other restrictions that we cover in our database, but not only. I mean, there are also a couple of richer countries, more developed kind of OECD countries that we have found are relatively more restricted compared to other countries that are then less restricted. And then you can do some other metrics that we have also found with our work, and that goes into the more analytical part. I mean, you can see here, again, on the left-hand panel, you can see the number of restrictions that are related to data localization, local storage and conditional flow regimes that we cover under the subchapter of restrictions related to cross-border flow of data. And this has been rising, I mean, over the last couple of years and rising quite fast. And then you can also relate that to trade flows that we have done here in the right-hand panel. Then you can see that if you take all the countries that, for example, have implemented data localization measures that would cover around sort of 15% of global trade flows in digital services here. So that is summarized here on the right-hand panel. And so these are the type of things that you can do. And then also the index itself for, in particular, chapter 8 is something that me and Martina Ferencz have sort of developed further, because the DTRI index itself is only for 1 year. So it's really a cross section for 1 year. Because we did not have, you know, so many resources to go back in time, but we have done that for one chapter, again, there where the most interest was, and that was for chapter 8, that covers data-related restrictions. And then in the left-hand panel, you can see something that, you know, these restrictions have gone up as much as also Janos has showed us. And yeah, if you do an update that me and Martina are currently doing for only this chapter, you can see in the right-hand panel that also for the last couple of years, I mean, these restrictions have gone up, at least those that are related to the cross-border flow of data. Now here again, I mean, you can do sort of cool stuff with this data that we have described. For example, you can show where countries are placed on a map if you would use that index and you would plot that, for example, against the extent to which all these countries are really trading trading digital services trade, and how important that digital services trade is in their economy. If you would plot these kind of information points next to each other, you can see a map like this, where again, you know, countries like China, Turkey, and Russia are relatively more restricted related to regarding the cross-border flow of data. But these are also the countries that are trading a lot less in digital services. Now, there is some heterogeneity going on, so there is a lot of variation going on. But of course, the trick then is to find out whether what we think is going on here is really true. And that has been done in some sort of analytical work that me and Martina also have done in a couple of papers that you were summarized here. So for instance, we have really looked at whether these data-related restrictions are affecting productivity for industries and also firms. And so we have sort of established that link that we have published. And then also we have done this we have researched that same question of data-related restrictions for digital services trade. And that's what you see here in the second bullet point, that was in a paper that we have published now. And then also we have done, I mean, a bit of further work in terms of not so much looking at the restrictiveness of these kind of measures that we have picked up, but in terms of how the different sort of regulatory frameworks that countries have related to data, how that is looking like in the world. And that is a more recent paper as a sort of a spin-off, if you want, of our work, where we have looked at the different regulatory models, if you want, of data-related restrictions in the world.
Erik,
yes.
Sorry for interrupting. In the interest of time, could you wrap up?
No, I'm done.
Is it done? Super. All right, fantastic.
Yep.
There was one question about, I think, what, how we go about voluntary measures or self-certification. Did I understand Susan correctly that she would cover that in her presentation, or shall we entertain that question now? So the question was, let me just put it out there, and when does a data flow regulation actually become a barrier across the different databases? Consider the Australian approach, which is a form of self-adequacy determination at the firm level. Would you consider this a barrier? So I'd put this very quickly to Erik. If you could give a short answer if possible, and Susan may add to this, but it would be her turn now anyway. Erik, quick answer if you wanted to.
I mean, what we have done is to really sort of try and develop certain criteria for which we have, for which we think that would be defined as restrictiveness. And so that is what you could see in one or two slides that I presented, where, for example, if there was a really data localization requirement for a certain type of information, then that is what we then sort of include in our database and also in our index. Now, there is, of course, I mean, a degree to which, I mean, some of these restrictions are more sort of burdensome for firms and others are less burdensome for firms. And that's also what we have taken into account with the scoring and the weighting. And so that is all there in the report. There is also a second side. I think what this question is referring to more or less is about some of these countries have different models of how to treat data if you want to send this abroad or not. And so that sort of refers to the different regulatory models. So one model has, for example, adequacy involved, whereas other models have not. That is not part of the DTRI. That's not part of our index, but that is part of a second step that we have done where we have mapped the different sort of regulatory systems, if you want. And that's what you could find in the last paper.
Yeah, thanks, Erik. And I'm certainly glad that you were at least able to take one of your chapters, which is a data flow chapter, forward and update that, if not the entire data. So that's great. Now let me move right along to Susan Aaronson. Susan is a research professor of international affairs at George Washington University and is a cross-disciplinary fellow and affiliate of DW's Institute for International Economic Policy. She's also a director and I guess a founder of the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub, which aims to educate policymakers, the media, and the public about both domestic and international data governance issues. Susan's also a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance in
Okay, Ingo, let's leave time for questions. It doesn't matter. Just because I really think that the key thing here is for us to provide the differences. So forgive me for being rude to you, but no one needs to.
I was just going to say that you are one of the most eminent scholars we have on data governance. So go ahead.
Okay, thank you for those kind words. This discussion as to what is a trade barrier is what motivated the project, because about 4 years ago, we did a survey internationally of what various people thought were barriers to cross-border data flows. And it proceeds from this notion that nations have to do two things, right? They have to protect their citizens from harm. And these days, they have to create an enabling environment for data-driven innovation. So the point is, they are going to regulate. And so at what point does it become a trade barrier? That, our belief is that there will be these conflicts until nations come to terms and instead of relying on the exceptions, delineate what really is a barrier, we're going to have these problems. So what we wanted to do is to point out how much regulation is already happening and how much convergence, divergence there is. So that was the first thing. So what we did is we did a desk study. We only have 1 year of data, but we wanted to see how much governance is there of personal, public, and proprietary data at the national and international levels. We received funding from 3 different groups, and eventually we were able to cover 52 countries. And all of this is on our website. But we focused only on hard law. But I have to tell you that's pretty damn inadequate because there's been so much soft law and structural changes. And I just cite as example, two examples of structural changes would be almost every nation now, every data-driven leading economy has digital trade commercial service officers. They're, Denmark, the UK, Canada have data ambassadors. So there's been structural changes too. But in any case, we wanted to see, was there any correlations with income, things like that. What we found is every case study nation is regulating for all three types of data. I need to correct this. I'm not sure that no nation has a comprehensive or systemic approach. And that's what we're trying to define right now. But let me just get into the first findings. So we did find significant convergence on personal data protection laws. And what we defined as a comprehensive approach, which was very interesting. Did they govern both the public and private sector's use of personal data? And interestingly enough, we found not all wealthy nations have a comprehensive approach. On public data, there was a lot of convergence, except that we found many nations don't make their public data available in a machine readable format, which means it's harder to use it for data analysis. Okay, everybody knows there's increasing convergence in trade agreements. We wanted to look at things like interoperability and cybersecurity, which were aspirational things, whereas there is much more binding on electronic authentication, e-signatures and stuff like that. So again, we're not covering every country, but 52 countries. And, this was pretty high. So what does all this mean? Oh, one other thing, which is we thought that nations had some innovative approaches, and whether or not they're good approaches, that's a different research question. But some of the things that we found were more and more countries were reviewing foreign investment in data-rich firms. More and more countries were using corporate governance rules. Data sharing was, the thing. We were most interested to do, almost every country requires government to make most of its public data public, but we wanted to see how many countries had encouraged business to government data sharing. And so that was even higher. And then we looked to see if personal data protection focused on collective rights, because as everybody knows, this is a problem for us collectively in groups, not just as individuals. Okay, so this is really my last slide, so we can have some questions. The next thing we're going to do next week, we'll be sending out a paper about data governance innovation. And then we're moving on to the data governance comprehensiveness. And so I'll tell you who we think has this, and that's the UK, Japan, EU, and Estonia. No, maybe China. When we say has this, we have 12 criteria, and no nation had all 12. But some of the things we looked at is, do they look at spillover effects? So for example, do they have somebody in charge of the data-driven economy or data governance who tries to anticipate problems and look at the side effects of problems? Do they have soft law? So for example, do they have a data strategy? Do they have an AI strategy? Is it linked to the governance of data? Okay, and then the final paper that we'll put out in October is Are Nations Using Data Governance to Achieve Comparative Advantage in Data? Thanks for hearing me out, and I look forward to everybody's questions.
Thank you very much, Susan. Fantastic project, and obviously a lot in the pipeline that we would be looking forward to these papers. I think the question that you started off with, the trick is to know a barrier when you see one. I think that clearly is at the core of it. And we had a question in the chat that asked us to comment a little bit on the differences between all of these databases. and I think that's a flip side of the same coin to me, because different initiatives focus on different things, and so people seem to be having different views on what is a barrier. Now, having said that, if only for resource reasons, no one can be comprehensive in that area, certainly. So in that sense, I notice that the differences that we have heard across the 4 presentations actually something good, because these initiatives and these databases are complementary, in a good sense. I notice that the Digital Policy Alert has competition policy in it, which the others, at least I didn't catch it. The OECD focuses a lot on infrastructure and connectivity, and there is where 62%, 2/3 nearly, of the measure incidence seems to fall. ECIPE has mobility and mode 4 measures in it, which I thought was very interesting for services trade and digital trade. And Susan's project by design focuses on data governance, which is something slightly different. Can I stop waffling and put this out to the 4 panelists? Would you like to share your thoughts on, comment perhaps on the differences, but also what you see, what are these crucial barriers? When is a barrier to digital trade or data flows? Who wants to go first?
I'll go first.
Sure.
I mean, I think in truth, there isn't what our survey in 2019, so it's totally out of date, found is there isn't a consensus on defining what is a barrier to digital trade. We proceed from 2 insights. First, the data is different. So the regulation of data has to be different from the regulation of other goods and services regulated by trade agreements. Why? Because there are so many different types of data, and obviously there are lots of different types of services, but because data can be a public good, right? It can, it's essential to economic growth now, but policymakers don't know when it is an import or when it is an export, right? Location is very difficult to determine. So we need to think differently about how we regulate digital trade, but we also have to acknowledge, this is second insight, that nations have to regulate it in order to create that enabling environment and protect their citizens from harm. So the fact that there isn't a consensus leads me to believe that, and you look at what's happening at the WTO, which is some nations are bowing out. Why? They say, in India and South Africa say, we need to figure out our domestic regulations first before we can regulate it globally. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Let me give you one other example. The EU has had the longest system of personal data protection, and yet it really doesn't have its house in order in terms of delineating how to regulate it. There's lots of cases involving this. It's been done unevenly by member states. So how do we go and say to developing countries that in a time of COVID, where they have to put resources towards protecting public health, they should put resources towards protecting personal data when no one knows yet how to do that. So we're in the state where we're telling countries to regulate, but we're also, the richest countries, the most advanced in the digital economy, are saying this is a trade barrier. So their trade barriers are location, localization, and source code requirements. But what about other things that really distort the global internet, like internet shutdowns? So in any case, I think we need to think long and hard about how we regulate this at the national and international level, and not presume that the trade regime is going to get it right initially.
Yes, and exactly as you say, Susan, I think these links have to be made. I think the OECD in their latest digital economy report has sort of mapped out which countries have a national AI strategy. But the ramifications or knock-on effects of what that might mean for national trade policy going forward is not at all obvious. Maybe it's my ignorance, but it's not that fleshed out. Does Erik, Janos, Bosch or Johannes want to chip in on that question?
I would like to first I second Susan's observation from our scoping exercise that it's very hard to grasp what a barrier was, and so we currently set our eyes on, can we define something that is like a deviation from best practice or the norm, where we have different attributes. Like in the global trade alert, the attribute is, right, how do you treat foreign versus domestic firms? But here, this is much more difficult. In most interesting cases, yes, as Susan says, there are some where this can be done, but the attributes that we are looking at is really also is how the policy process is transparent. Is there the ability to engage, and the outcome itself on how does it look different from what we see elsewhere? And so it's more the deviation from the norm, best practice, if you wish, that we are setting our eyes on. That's not the barrier, but that's the way we approaching it right now, since it's such a ambiguous topic.
Yes, although the way I understood Susan is that it's not entirely obvious in certain areas what best practice is, because it's got pros and cons to it, right? So, but it's a very nice remark, Johannes, and it harks back to a question that we just got in the chat, that observed that most of the presentations, and I've been in my own work guilty of that for 10 years, that we try to put our finger on what is a barrier. But of course, what also matters is a facilitating environment, and I think that is what you were just alluding to, Johannes. Not doing something that is required, say, for creating trust, a trusted online environment, is actually what matters, and not so much what barrier you actually put on. So let me read that out to you. Is there any particular work that speaks to how data policies may be framed to facilitate digital trade and possibly minimize these barriers?
The World Development Report has lots of good things. And the one that just came out, and UNCTAD is about to release a very interesting report that's very critical of, let's call it, the digital behemoths and the role of the platforms. And so I agree with you that we need to delineate what a appropriate regulatory environment looks like, but data-driven change is happening very fast, and regulators can't keep up. None of us can. And until we address the enormous power of these platforms, and which is a national job because we don't have regulatory coherence on competition policy, and also until we address the market for data, which is opaque, I worry if we can ever figure this out. I'd be curious to know what others think.
Yes, thank you, Susan. Further on that question of what is a barrier, with a question, should we not use existing principles to identify whether these are barriers? So MFN, non-discrimination, national treatment. If non-discriminatory, how can we justify that this is a barrier? We got this in the question. I know, Erik, I picked up from your presentation that you had this nice bar chart where half of your index was from domestic policies and the other half was from border crossing policies. I was going to ask you about this. Is this really non-discriminatory versus discriminatory, and how can we just add it?
Yeah, so that goes back to, I think, the first question that you asked, on which I would like to say something. I think on the basis for the ECIPE index, at least, what we had in mind always was, to what extent are measures restricting foreign firms versus domestic firms, and to what extent are measures restricting activities offline compared to online, or online compared to offline. So that matrix was also always put in our mind. And so with that, we started to categorize it. And obviously, as we all know, because I think most of the people are familiar to the services trade field, some of these measures are not explicitly discriminatory for foreign firms, right? And so then things become a bit sort of blurred. And then it's also, yeah, I would sort of say an evolving discussion of what becomes a restriction and what becomes not a restriction. And so we also struggled sometimes with terminologies like, okay, so it's a restriction, is it really a trade barrier, etc. But then you become in, sort of a semantical thing. But I mean, that was always the underlying system for which we categorize things. And then it becomes also very difficult for new kind of stuff, right? So Susan pointed out to internet shutdowns. I mean, to what extent is that really discriminatory? To what extent not? And to what extent, I mean, you know, is it offline and online? Obviously, it's online, but how much does it affect offline? So these kind of things, I mean, the digital field is ever evolving. Things are becoming more digitalized. So there is a lot of discussion going to do. And I mean, for us, we always said from the start, nothing is set in stone. So our database in that sense is also evolving, because I think the restrictions are also evolving into more discriminatory or non-discriminatory elements. Now, there is another thing that I would like to pick up on. A question is whether also the sort of the more positive elements of a policy is picked up in the database. For us, yes. So it's something, if a certain type of policy is absent that could accommodate trade, for example, a framework for online consumer protection, then we also cover that in our database.
Yeah, I think that this is very pertinent indeed. Now, I realize just about when we get into full swing of a good discussion, we are coming up to the full hour. So I think our time, unfortunately, is over. Janos.
Ingo, can I just maybe chip in a bit, because I think this is a very important question, and maybe just a few words on how our understanding on the digital STRI revolves around what a barrier is. So I think every discussion about the trade barrier should start at the GATS framework. And we already got a really good understanding of what a trade barrier is if we look at the GATS framework and the GATS measures. And from there, we can also look at what transcends as new emerging issues into more recent RTAs and FTAs. But I think what's really difficult sometimes is to draw a benchmark. And for the STRI particularly, we can only measure something when we know what we can measure it against. So what is the benchmark? And defining that in a very rapidly evolving environment, especially on digital trade, is really difficult. So what we do in the STRI is not try to guess what that benchmark should be, but rather leave it to the policy discussions and other institutions like WIPO, the ITU, all those specialized institutions that they have their mandate to set these benchmarks. And then when we have that benchmark, we would be able to integrate that into the STRI framework. And just maybe a final thought that leads also onto the complementarity of the different tools that we discussed today. To me, there's a lot of complementarity because we have different scopes, different approaches, but I think we all work towards the same goal. And particularly what's really important is to find ways for us to develop a common understanding of what digital trade barriers are. And with that common understanding, we can maybe provide more coherent messages to policymakers that in turn would eventually derive a bit more coherent policies on digital trade.
Absolutely. I think, Erik, we have to draw it to a close now because we are overrunning already. These were very pertinent comments, Janos. And food for thought ahead, because I think, as Susan rightly said, the soft law and other strategies and frameworks out there have a bearing on digital trade, and we need to be on our toes and figure out how they affect digital trade. I don't want to overrun too much. Let me thank the Council on Economic Policies for organizing the event, and our four panelists, Susan, Johannes, Janos, and Erik, for sharing their time and their insights. I hope it's been good fun for everyone. We've learned something. I think the OECD and the ECIPE's presentations both showed that the incidence of measures is on the rise, but I interpret this at least in part as a lamppost phenomenon, right? So we are shining some light now on it, and that is, I guess, a good thing. Thank you everyone for having joined us. Stay well and safe, and goodbye.